Simulation Happy Hour acknowledges the land and the waters from which you are listening today. Welcome to Simulation Happy Hour. Sit back, relax, and let's talk about all things sim.
Welcome to Simulation Happy Hour. I'm Jane Frost.
I'm Jenny Bassett.
And I'm Kerry Reed-Searle. Today, I'd like to introduce Johanna Rhodes. Johanna is from New Zealand, and I think her work is something that's going to be very keenly sought in terms of the listeners and understanding the psychological safety around simulation and the importance of debriefing. I had the privilege of meeting Jo many years ago in New Zealand when I was doing some mask ed work. And Jo was very enthusiastic. In fact, we had dinner and I challenged her to go to dinner in her pajamas, and thinking that she thought that I might turn up in my pajamas too. But no, Jo turned up in her pajamas while I was finely dressed. So Jo, over to you. Totally not associated with this discussion, but look, Jo, I'd like to again welcome you and tell us a little bit about your research, Jo.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, most people think that simulation's all about the learners, but I wanted to understand about the people who actually run the simulations. So my research explored the experiences of healthcare educators who assume simulated patient roles through multiple different modalities of simulation. Much of the literature that I reviewed had asked all about student experiences and the learning experiences, but there was really nothing about the educators' experiences, the emotional, the psychological, and the professional challenges that they may navigate. This led me to develop the theory of coexistence, which basically captured how educators balance two overlapping motivations. On one hand, their altruistic desire to support student learning and their own egoistic need to protect their well-being. Immersing themselves in this role was found to be very rewarding, but also very taxing. And my research highlighted how institutions and colleagues can support these unsung heroes in simulation education. You could say education is like superheroes and humans at the same time. They need recognition and space to recharge.
Wow. So in essence, I guess what you're saying, Jo, in all of this work, that you found that we spend a lot of time debriefing learners.
Yes.
And those educators that come in playing, when we talk about simulated patient roles, I'm understanding that could be someone who's just doing a role play with them disguised as somebody else, commonly mask ed, or it could even be the person talking through the simulator. And in essence, we finish the debrief session, or we finish the session, we debrief the students, and there you are as an educator thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder how that went. Or if something really impacted on us, who's there to unpack what has actually happened for us? And I certainly know from my work in mask ed, where we invest so much of ourselves in those simulations, there is a huge risk, because part of the character design has come from perhaps personal experiences, people that you care about. And then when things go belly up in that simulation, you walk away from the classroom, students are beautifully debriefed, but what about us? So, Jo, my question next is, what unique challenges do you think simulation educators face when in role, or when in role and as they de-roll out of that particular role?
Yeah, Kerry, you've hit the nail on the head. Stepping into that role can be incredibly complex, and educators have to feel the sense of responsibility to be fully authentic and make it realistic for the learner, which means accessing their own emotions, their own reactions, and even physical behaviours outside of their comfort zone. And it's not just acting, there's a professional responsibility that underpins that in that accurate representation of clinical settings. And then the de-rolling, which you mentioned, part of that debrief, that just simply doesn't happen. The person takes off their mask or takes off their muleage or turns the mannequin off, and it's just meant to end. But it's not as simple as just taking off a hat. Some educators do find it hard to step back. Emotional responses can linger, or there can be a sense of transference that lasts a lot longer than the simulation itself. Sometimes, you finish your simulation and your heart's still racing and you're still thinking about, but what about me? It's a juggling act between being fully present in a role as well as protecting your own well-being, which links in with the psychological safety that is of concern for educators in this cohort.
So true, Joe. And I think the more we try to be authentic and create realistic experiences for students, the more we invest in it and the more risk we are for ourselves. Sometimes I think when I've been in a classroom and there's a second person co-teaching with you, that's fantastic because you can
Yes.
chat but when you're on your own, some of those experiences have left me personally feeling really vulnerable and stuff that I sort of think about years later. And it's interesting because some of your students that you come across years later always remember a particular simulation.
Yes.
So it's pretty powerful. I'll stop asking all the questions. I'm going over to my colleague, Jen. Jen, would you like to ask Joe some questions around this?
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, Joe, so can you help our listeners understand the importance of debriefing, not just for the learners, but also for the educators after the simulation session, please?
Absolutely, Jen. Well, as we know, debriefing is often framed, and it's framed for learners. There's lots of different methods for that, but educators actually need it just as much. It gives them a structured space to reflect, unpack what just happened, and importantly, to let go of that emotional load that they may be carrying, like a mini reset in effect. Without it, educators, I believe, run the risk of carrying unresolved stress that could affect their well-being and performance in future simulations. I think it's often forgotten, Jen, that educators are processing too, and they deserve a moment to unpack the intensity of a scenario and make sense of it. Psychological safety isn't a buzzword. It lets educators have a voice. If a scenario was intense, it's okay, they may need a moment. And I think it's important that it's recognised that how important it is for learners, equally it needs to be valued and seen as important for the person who's assumed that role.
Yeah, I really agree with that one, Joe. I think sometimes, and it's not just immediately after you've done the simulation, as Kerry's just given us example, it can sometimes be much later on down the track. So with that knowledge, can you give us a bit of an outline of what your recommendations for like psychological safety for educators might look like, please, Joe?
Yeah, well, I think firstly it's about creating a culture where educators feel seen, heard, and supported. It means dedicated time with peers or supervisors to validate their experiences and for that to be done in a confidential way. Some scenarios do trigger stress and even personal memories, so access to professional support or counselling, I believe, is actually the way forward. Similar to supervision that mental health nurses have in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We need to recognise that educators are human within this, and while the character they've played is not quote unquote real, it's very real to the person who's played it and to the learners who experienced it. So, a framework around policy is essential that integrates not only time for the creation of these characters and the scenarios and everything else that is very well known about simulation, but equally the aftermath of simulation as well, to protect the integrity of the simulations moving forward.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to hand over now to Jane. She's got a couple of questions for you.
Hi, Joe, and thanks for that. I think you've touched on some of the points that I was going to ask you about, but I'm going to ask the questions anyway and see if there's anything that you'd like to elaborate on. But first of all, I love the analogy of the superhero and the timeout. I thought that was a really great analogy that you spoke about earlier. So my questions are, what strategies help maintain educators' well-being in simulation education?
Well, in my research, that was very varied, but sort of to sort of summarise it, is peer support networks would be invaluable. A quick chat with someone who gets it, who's perhaps been there or understood, or as Kerry alluded to earlier, in the room at the moment of that simulation as well. But equally, that person may need some debriefing as well as the observer. Structured supervision, of course, can help educators reflect on challenging scenarios and potentially receive some guidance, because chances are they're going to repeat that scenario in future learning activities. Some participants in my study had personal rituals that they found surprisingly effective. One key one being shaking off the character at the end, which is a technique out of the method acting technique of Stan Valesky. But the institutions play a role too, and recognition of this being an issue is essential. Small gestures of appreciation of time, formal acknowledgement can go a long way. I think if we want educators at their best, there has to be support that's actually formalised and resourced, to and not just assumed.
Thanks, Jo. So my next question was about what type of institutional support, training and professional development do you recommend for simulation educators?
Yeah, Jane, I think that's a great question, because ongoing education is the key, not just in technical simulation skills. I mean, simulation is advancing rapidly with, especially with AI, mannequins, all of that. It's just advancing really fast. But actually, that debriefing and role immersion and emotional resilience, there needs to be some resourcing into that with ongoing education. Professional development, I think, could include workshops on managing stress, but specific to being another character. So, borrowing some of the techniques from the acting world, I think, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to acknowledge this as a situation. Understanding the psychology of role play, or even basic acting techniques to enhance that authenticity. I think also the formalisation of support systems is essential, rather than just being the educator's problem, because what tends to happen if it's not formal, it won't happen, because there'll always be something else that becomes more important. We want educators to thrive when they're assuming simulated patient roles, not just survive. And I think if there's an element of value to the expertise of these educators, that's going to enhance the quality of simulation-based education.
Thanks, Jo. I'm going to hand back over to Kerry for some more questions. But some really good insights there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. Look, I'm hearing very much loud and clear that organisations have a bit of a responsibility to their staff who are participating in simulation to really look at that preparation and that education. And I think sometimes that's, we talk about preparing, and I'm going to use Mask Ed again. We run 2-day workshops, and this is part that we have never ever discussed, the actual debriefing of the person who's playing the actual role. We spend a lot of time talking about the debriefing of the participants, the learners. I guess one of the things I wanted to raise was the more complex or risky the simulation is. So that simulation where there is higher stakes really needs that absolute preparation of the educator who is assuming that role. And I think sometimes we may see people go in, oh, I'm just going to play this particular role. Now, one of the things I don't think they sometimes realise is who is in that audience. And if that audience person has a direct response to that educator who is playing a particular role that may become triggers for that learner, that's where their responses back to that educator can be really, really challenging. And I use one example, Jo, when I was working with some very experienced educators in Darwin. And I said, are you ready for this role? Are you ready to play with this interaction with Mask Ed? And I played and assumed this role, and the person reacted really, really in a very challenging way. And this was an experienced educator, broke down and was, had to lead the simulation. And I went and spoke to her afterwards. She said, everything you were doing was my father. And
Yes.
he just recently passed away. So my response back was, oh my gosh, what have I done in my role? And it's something that never ever left me. But we all debriefed her, but nobody debriefed about, well,
Yes.
what were you doing? So I think as educators, how do we, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about this, in educators, what recommendations do you sort of have as we're designing our simulations where there is potential high stakes, where we may impact on learners without even realizing? Have you got any thoughts about that in terms of the design and preparation? And I've just thrown this question to you. You
No,
haven't
that's
even
all.
prepared.
No, that's all good. I think the key is that you've got to listen to the educators and not just let them carry on and do what they're doing. Listen to what they need. And if they are saying, I need time after this to be able to unpack this, or I need professional supervision to enable me to externally talk about my experiences or the impact I've had on students or the impact students have had on me as well, because that also interacts. A student might grab your hand at a moment when that seemed a bit strange, or do something, and you're sort of got to act in the moment while maintaining your character. Making sure there's provision for what the educator needs, and for not every not every educator will need the same support, but if there's resourcing available, then you can listen to your educators and go, here's what's available, what do you need, help us to help you. Ensuring that workload expectations meet the demands of the role. And I think you've hit on a really key point. Some of these really impacting simulations, particularly around things that there's many different cultures and many different beliefs, death, dying, pregnancy, like there's a whole lot of different feelings that people have around those very, very sensitive life events. And so I think that it's sort of almost a cultural safety situation where you've got to understand your own culture so that you can understand that the people around you are possibly going to experience it differently from how you are. And
Mm.
so I think actually cultural safety comes into play with this as well. And because these are all quite sort of the grayer areas of nursing, let's say, we get into that whole scenario where it's not black and white. If we do this, the cause will be this. So I think we've got to be really careful that we continue to listen to people when we're deciding on what resources are needed for the support of these incredible educators, the superheroes, as we're going to now call them.
Mm.
And acknowledging their contribution as well, acknowledging that looks really tough this morning. Are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Or, Kerry, I really liked when Cyril did that this morning. What was that like for you behind him? And just sort of really, even the little things that come out, particularly in simulations where you as the patient cry, and in some cases those tears are real because it's actually impacted you, and you're not having to act, you are actually crying behind a mask or behind your mullage or through the mannequin or whatever. So I think it should be a culture where well-being is the priority rather than an afterthought.
So true. And Jo, and I know your research fairly well, having had the privilege of supervising you. And I know from that research there was a lot of, and I go back to Mask Ed, where that high risk, that high, we immerse ourselves in the roles, we become somebody else. And that isn't just a one-off simulation. It is a character that continues throughout, potentially a whole 3 years of a student's degree. And so it's not just something that we let go. When students challenge that character, it's actually an insult on yourself. And one of the things we've always done in our workshops is really encourage people when they're doing role play not to play themselves and try to create those characters that are removed from their own personal journey, where you haven't got such a risk of when things are impacting so personally. But at the same time, I say that it's so hard not to, because there are certainly character traits that you really love about somebody that is endearing and encourages those learners to have that lovely connection with you. And so the greater the vulnerability for you of the character in your design, the greater the vulnerability you are to learners who are within your midst. So I guess what I'm learning and what I'm hearing from here, Joe, is that absolute importance of debriefing nurses or educators who are assuming patient roles. Being really mindful of how they design their characters. And I have 3 Ds: do not play yourself, don a prop, and D roll after that particular experience. So in a nutshell, Joe, I've got 3 sort of final questions here. What do you recommend then to institutions looking forward to better support educators? So if some of our audience members here actually run simulation studios or simulations at various organisations, what are some of the things you're going to their takeaway messages today?
I think because all educational institutions are businesses, you're going to have a policy around it, or else it won't happen. So I think the black and white, so to be able to turn something grey, black and white, is through policy. So you're going to need a policy. You're also going to need regulatory bodies to acknowledge the educator's role in simulation as well through their standards. So, every program's accredited against the Nursing Council or similar within the country that you're in. And so I think it's really important that it starts at that regulatory level, that educator psychological safety is acknowledged in there in some form, that requires education facilities to have a policy around the resourcing and support of educators who are working within simulation. And it's not, I don't think, only the people who are assuming the roles, it's the people working with those people as well. Because, like you said, you do try to be a character that's different from yourself, but things like personal care, things like death, those really, really life events will trigger someone.
So it's
And
really
so,
around
yeah,
workplace health and safety too, isn't it? We
it's
hear
an
about
extension of.
we hear about the psychological safety around learners. We hear about the psychological safety around workplace in terms of, generally caring for one another as colleagues. This is another part of that workplace health and safety. So
Yeah,
I'm just wondering then, Joe, where do you see the role of simulation educators evolving in the next few years when we consider this whole area and I'm going to really emphasize this psychological safety that links in with debriefing for educators who are playing those simulated roles?
I think educators are central to healthcare education in multiple ways, that they facilitate, they research curriculum developments and advocates for wellbeing. Now it's time to twist that and have it for themselves as well. Learner at the centre, I 100% support learner at the centre, but let's not forget about the people around that centre. It's not the learner being the pizza and we're just the cheese on top. Actually, we are the base of what that outcome is going to be. I think more investment is needed in the education, but I'd also like to see greater international collaboration, because I think you could have a lot of sort of support networks internationally where it would take away from being people that you always know, because sometimes you will debrief stronger with someone who essentially is not known to you. You're not going to have to face them the next day. So, sometimes debriefing with a colleague can be very awkward if you then share an office with them that afternoon, if it's been quite deep. Other times that's absolutely what you need, is a friendly face. But I think some international collaboration around this is absolutely essential moving forward, and not having little pockets of silos. I think it could be internationally managed to make it, to share best practice, and keeping the simulations realistic without overburdening educators with the responsibility. I think in education it's such an exciting time. The field is so maturing in so many ways. Let's pause to make a real difference for everyone involved. And yeah, a branch of health and safety, but absolutely essential to health and safety.
Yep, and I go back, Joe, to that previous comment, being really mindful about your design of your simulation. And
Yeah.
I think, too, taking on roles, one has to be really also mindful of the authenticity of that
Yes.
role. So if you are playing a particular role, then you've done the research around what those mannerisms might look like, what that dialogue might be, because that can also open you for criticism from learners if they themselves have somebody who is experiencing that
Yes.
same condition. So again, homework, preparation, having ideally somebody in that, the higher the stakes, the more support you have in that classroom, whether a second educator is fantastic, even just during the simulation where they're actually doing the role play. I think too, the authenticity in the moulage and whatever donning of the props, whatever you're going to be wearing, is also really important. And understanding what your objectives are and keeping on task, because again, I think when we go off task, we move away from objectives. Even though we might have capture a teachable moment, we can also set ourselves on a trajectory where we're open to more vulnerability. Joe, this has been really stimulating, and I really hope our audience has gained something from it. For me, as someone who designed Mask Ed, this has been a real gap in our preparation of people who assume these roles. And as I say, these are, in Mask Ed, it is an incredibly invested role, a lot of vulnerability, a lot of character build that not is just for a one-off simulation, but can be over many years. And we know from your research some of the challenges those people who have played, not just in Mask Ed, but in playing assuming roles that are regular visitors to those learning environments, put themselves even at greater risk. Yeah.
So right, Kerry. I mean, you're wearing so many hats as an educator. You're an actor, a scientist, a therapist, a mentor, and curiosity and empathy and a sense of humour are so essential. But let's not take advantage of our educators. Let's put the resourcing and the support in place to protect their psychological safety. Understand the demands of this work. It's not as simple as let's become someone else and have some fun for the day. There's a lot more complexities than that.
Okay, look, that's all from me. I'm just wondering if there's any other questions from our wonderful team that are here today. Jenny and Jane, do you have anything else? Jen.
Yeah, Joe, I've got a question. If I wanted to know more about this, have you written a paper somewhere that I could read a bit more about this, given its emerging information from your research? Is there a paper somewhere?
Well, Jenny, funny you should ask that question. Not yet, but there will be.
Great. So if I keep an eye out, you can let us know when that's released and we'll let our listeners know.
100%, absolutely.
Lots of conferences, but watch for the paper. Watch for the papers that are going to, not just one, there'll be multiple.
There we are.
Good. Yeah, no, it's interesting because if I want to know more about it, I think this is new emerging research that there may not be a lot of information out there yet. So thanks, girls. I think that's fantastic. So Jane, if you don't have any questions, I'll ask our last famous question.
Can I just ask one question? And that is, I think this is amazing research, Joe. And I think that your work will really help people to ask for that support, but how do you think we actually get that investment from institutions to actually protect? I mean, that's the curly question, isn't it? That's the one that we're all asking. We know we need to do this, but how are we going to prove that this is valuable? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's got to be integrated into regulatory standards, and it's got to be integrated into policy, because when we're working with businesses, that is the only way that money will happen, is if it's a requirement. So simulation is now becoming part of your regulatory standards in healthcare. So that's a really good platform to then be building on and saying to institutions, well, this is a requirement, therefore you need to put some resourcing into place. And I think, having been a head of faculty before, it has to start at that level for it to be real and seen as an investment. As Jenny's alluded to, more research, a paper from this research, or papers, as Kerry said, from this research, getting it out there and putting it out there and making it real. But you've got to be talking to the people who actually hold the wallet. And that's generally through your regulatory standards, your legislation, and your policies.
Thanks, Jo.
Thanks, Jo. I think that's been a really interesting chat, what happens for actual educators, because as you say, sometimes the focus is on the students or the learners in simulations. So our last question, and so far we've been asking all our listeners this, and we've been travelling around the world having drinks all over the world. So if you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be and what would your drink of choice be, Jo?
Wow, if I could be anywhere in the world, there's no place like home, right?
Yep.
I would love to be back in the beautiful Spain with all of you wonderful people. That's a very treasured memory. But honestly, somewhere peaceful in Aotearoa, New Zealand, over the beach, just sipping a nice cold drink of anything, really. But just the peace of the tranquility of a New Zealand beach. Yeah, why not? That time out.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jo.
Okay, look, thank you so much, Jo, and thank you, Jane and Jen, and all the best to our sick colleague, Mel, who will be back on track for the next one, I'm hoping. So thank you, everybody, and I think it's over and out from us for today. So see you soon.
Ka kite.